All right, welcome back, everyone. By this point, you should be done with the unit on the Gilded Age. And in that unit, one of the themes that ran through every single course of study was the idea that the Gilded Age had a lot of problems, social problems, economic problems, political problems. There was corruption. And as you went through the period from 1865 to 1900, these things were becoming apparent to just about everyone. And so starting around 1890, there was a desire for reform that took hold within the United States. Not everybody would have been interested in this reform, but enough people were interested in it that by the time you get to 1900, there is a groundswell of support within the country for what is going to be called the Progressive Era. So we're going to get started into this. This is going to take you through a number of things with the progressives. What we're doing here today is just an introduction. You will get more later on. So let's start with who exactly were the progressives. Okay? The progressives were the reformers of the late 1800s and early 1900s. They had their roots in all of the Gilded Age problems that existed. And what the progressives wanted to do is not only identify those problems, but also come up with solutions. Some of those problems were the political corruption, the political machines that existed at the local, state, and national level, the economic inequalities between the super rich and the super poor, the corruption within business, the exploitation of the consumers and the workers, the unrestrained monopolies that were out there taking advantage of everyone. Okay? They were also they had social concerns. Okay? There's poverty, there's crime. How do we clean those things up? Now, the thing with the progressives is, by and large, they don't want to remake and reshape everything. What they want is to fix and reform the system, whatever that system may be. You will see that phrase here again in a little bit, and I'll probably repeat it several times throughout here. So, who actually was on the ground, what we say boots on the ground, doing all the work of the progressive? Well, it actually ends up being the middle class. And the middle class are the ones that were kind of the people that were marching, doing everything. There were wealthy people who supported it, and they supported it financially. Of course, a lot of the poor and the working classes are going to support these ideas because they're the ones that they feel are being exploited and are being treated unequally. But they don't have the time, the ability to get involved in some of these things. So it's the middle class. And actually, a lot of the people that are involved in the day-to-day work were middle class women. Okay? Middle class women in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they don't have to work to be middle class at the turn of the 20th century. One person working could earn enough money to take care of the family and take care of it well. So that's where we kind of start getting the idea of women don't work. We never got that idea from the working classes. But these women, they had the time, they had the income, and so they're able to do things. And if you can remember back to the mid 1800s and the cult of domesticity, there was this view that they were fulfilling a motherly role. So they weren't stepping outside the realm of what we would say a woman's place is. They were instead just taking that to another place, to another level. I also want to point out that to call yourself a progressive did not limit you to one party or another. People who were progressives were people who wanted change. They wanted progress. They wanted to fix the problems. And so they came from both parties, both the Republicans and the Democrats. There are third parties out there. Many of those would also consider themselves progressives, but the ones we are concerned with are mainly the Democrats and Republicans. Ultimately, the goals of the progressives was they wanted to get government to pass laws that would clean up this economic, political, social corruption. So they want the government to act. One of the things they want government to do is make society and the economy equitable for everyone. Okay, that is a big deal with the progressives. And another thing with the progressives is because the things they are interested are so varied, and because people are people, and we may be progressive in one area but not progressive in another. As you go through the progressive era, we probably won't get there in this. You will see some people who are progressives, except in one area where they are very, very not progressive. But we still consider them part of the movement because there were places where they did want that reform. So there's no one true progressive cause or goal or anything like that. All right, let's get into some of the actual reforms. We're going to do political, social, and economic. So some of the political reforms, a lot of progressive beliefs were that problems could be solved through just the use of more democracy, getting more people involved in the vote, getting more people involved in the decision-making process, whatever that's going to look like. And so one of the first things the progressives wanted to see changed was the way elections functioned. So they're going to introduce a number of electoral reforms. We have 4 of them here. The first one is they introduced something called the Australian ballot. You probably know it as the secret ballot. And if you have ever been involved in any kind of election, you know that this is one of the things that we kind of hold sacred in the United States. The idea of nobody knows how I vote, so therefore I can vote however I want without fear of some kind of repercussion. We didn't have secret ballots during the Gilded Age. Like it was overt. Sometimes you would walk into the polling place and they would say, okay, if you want to vote for the Republicans, you go over there on the right. If you want to vote for the Democrats, you go over there on the left. And you just kind of walked in, said, hi, I'm here to vote for whoever. And they just counted your vote and that was it. You were done. For the businesses, if there was a certain thing that they wanted you to vote for or a certain candidate they wanted you to vote for, they would send people to watch the polls. They would have pictures of all the employees. And they would see, okay, which side did you turn to? Did you turn to the side that the business wanted you to? Or did you turn to the other side and probably tomorrow you're going to get fired for that? So that's kind of a big deal. Another thing that the progressives introduced, something that we use today that many of you may not be aware of or may take for granted, is they introduced the idea of the primaries. How do the Democrats and the Republicans choose the one candidate from their party for political office? Prior to the progressive era, the way that is done is party leaders get together and they discuss, who do we want to be the Democratic nominee for president? Who do we want to be the Democratic nominee for senator from our state, or the Republican nominee for Congress or governor, or what? And so those political party leaders, 100, 300, whatever it was, they made the decision, people, these will be your candidates. Here is the Democrat we have come up with, and the other side here's the Republican we've come up with, and those are your 2 choices. What if we, the people, don't like either one of those choices? And so the progressives introduced the primaries. So what you see up here, the pictures, I just pulled these. The picture over there on the left is from a couple of years ago, the U.S. Senate race in Texas. This was the Democrats, some of the Democrats that were running for the Democratic nomination. The Democrats are going to narrow these 4 down to 1 person. Over on the right, this is from, I believe it was Georgia, the Republican Senate primary. These 5 people wanted to be the Republican nominee for the Senate, and the individual Republican voters are going to narrow that down to one. And then those two will face off in the general election, which always happens in November, against the opponent from the opposing political party. Okay? And so this was giving the individual party members, the individual people out there that consider themselves Democrats or Republicans, it would give them the opportunity to pick their nominees for office. Another electoral reform that the progressives introduced is something called referendum. Referendum it's a tool used by the government to make sure that the laws they are passing are supported by the people. What the government does, a bill is filed in the legislature. Usually these happen on the local and state level. So a bill is filed. I'll pick on the state government. The legislature approves the bill. They send it to the governor. The governor signs it, but it is with a condition that that bill will not actually become law until it is submitted to the voters for them to approve. They have to approve it by a majority vote. If the voters approve that bill, it becomes law. If the voters do not approve that bill, it does not become law. And then the final thing that they came up with was something called the recall. There were problems in the Gilded Age with political corruption. And what happens when you get a politician in office and then you find out they are corrupt? How do you get rid of them in a time before they have passed laws to eliminate that? And the progressives come up with the idea of recall. A measure is filed, and the people say, we want to remove this person. You have to have a petition campaign. Enough people sign up saying, we want to remove this person from office before their term is up because we think they are corrupt, or the way it is used a lot now, we no longer like and value their policies. We no longer see benefit to their leadership. We want them removed, and removed immediately. Okay? The idea behind all these reforms is that this would help eliminate corruption in government. It would help eliminate corruption among our elected officials because they would be subject to all these things. Now, that's the main idea behind all this. And so we have all these things today, and we have the progressives to thank for that. A couple of important progressive politicians for this early part. Probably the most important one that you need to know is going to be this guy named Robert La Follette. Robert La Follette is the governor of Wisconsin. One of the things that he does is he appointed people who were experts in a given field to lead government agencies that were related to that field. So, as an example, if there is a Secretary of Education, Robert La Follette would probably appoint someone who has been a school administrator, and a superintendent, or maybe studies education. If there's the State Department of Health, he's going to appoint someone who's a doctor, somebody who studies health and effects of different things on the body. Okay, so those are supposed to be experts, as opposed to what we had seen a lot during the Gilded Age with patronage and the spoil system, giving those positions to your political supporters who may or may not have any clue what they're doing. He's also going to enact a law. He's one of the first states to enact those laws that the progressives put into place, the reforms that I talked about on the previous slide. And so through his actions, Wisconsin picks up the nickname the Laboratory of Democracy, because they were kind of at the leading edge of the progressive movement, getting all these things put into place. Now, a couple of other guys who were some early important progressive politicians, I'll just mention them. A guy named Hiram Johnson, he was governor of California, and then this is Charles Evans Hughes, who was governor of New York. I do want to point out that all the R's next to their names, that stand they were all Republicans. They just happen to be Republicans. There are plenty of Democrat politicians as well. Some of those The more important ones are going to be running for president or doing things on a more national level. These guys did things on a more state and local level. All right, so we'll spend a little bit more time on social reforms. Some of them, these early ones, you're going to be familiar with. The Gospel of Wealth. Okay, we talked about that in the Gilded Age. The Gospel of Wealth, one of the parts of it was the idea if you're wealthy, you should be using that money to the benefit of society. So that Gospel of Wealth does have a place within the idea of the progressive movement. There's also the social gospel. That was rooted within the church, within the idea that we must take the principles that are found in the Bible and put those into practice, especially the ideas of helping others and helping the people in need. And so we talked about the YMCA, the Salvation Army. There's other clubs. These are more secular. The Lions Club, the Rotary Club, if you've ever heard of something like this, these are usually middle class managerial people, small business owners in town who get together and say, we see problems, and on my own I can't fix a problem, but if we all, the middle class and the small business owners, get together, maybe we can do something about this. There's also just carried through from the Gilded Age that had been carrying through since the middle of the 1800s, the temperance movement, the prohibition movement, people who viewed alcohol as the cause of way more social problems than just plain old alcoholism. Okay? And so they're still active, still going, actually gaining steam during the Progressive Era. And they believed that if we could eliminate alcohol, it would kind of automatically help other issues and other problems that then just wouldn't be there because we've eliminated drunkenness. Now, some of the social reforms that we haven't seen before, the progressive movement included calls for civil rights reforms. In 1908, there is a race riot in Springfield, Illinois. Okay? Black neighborhoods are burned to the ground. And forget about, hey, this is a national embarrassment just on its own. It's viewed in 1908 as even more of a national embarrassment because Springfield, Ohio is the hometown of Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator. How can you have a race riot in the hometown of the guy who's responsible for freeing the slaves? And so out of this tragedy came something called the Niagara Movement. People who supported African American civil rights decided they were going to meet and they were going to talk about what needs to be done in order to protect African American civil rights. So they met in Niagara Falls. The original plan was to meet in Niagara Falls, New York. And when they went to check into the hotels were segregated. So they actually had to move across the Niagara River into Canada where it wasn't segregated in order to hold their meeting. They did come up with something called the Declaration of Principles. The Declaration of Principles essentially calls for the government to legally protect the civil rights of African Americans and do everything necessary to enforce those laws and provisions. It's a nice statement, and after a year, nothing has really been done. So a lot of the people that were there at Niagara, they get together again in 1909, and they form something called the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which you probably know as the NAACP. They were founded in order to push the goals of the Niagara movement, the goals that were laid out in the Declaration of Principles, and to make sure somebody was constantly fighting for those and pushing those things with the government. One of the guys that is a part of the NAACP early on is a guy named W.E.B. Du Bois. We should have seen his name in the Gilded Age as well when we talked about African Americans. He was the editor of the quarterly newsletter or magazine that the NAACP published called The Crisis. He was editor for something like 30 years or so. But he published this every quarter, every 3 months, talking about here's what's going on, here are the good things that happened, here's where we're still lacking. Now, another group of people that are interested in social reform, we're going to lump together, we call them the muckrakers. The muckrakers were journalists. They're these progressive journalists who saw problems in society and basically went out and exposed those problems and that corruption and whatever else to the public. That way everyone could see what was going on. And sometimes the muckrakers could be in a position where they might be able to offer a solution or an idea for a solution. Other times it was, they don't have a solution. But by making it public, maybe they can get it to where somebody can come up with a solution. Okay? A lot of them call attention to things that were done that now, because of their investigations, because of what they uncovered, because of what they exposed, we see as illegal. So just a couple of people and what they investigate. There was a woman named Ida Tarbell. She investigated Standard Oil, J.D. Rockefeller, and learned exactly how it was he was able to gain his monopoly. How did he put other companies out of business? It wasn't just because he had a better, cheaper product. It was because he used unfair business practices. He hired spies to go into other businesses and find out where, especially financially, they were weak, and then he would exploit that to shut them down. Right? He would, move into an area and undercut all the other producers in the local area and run them out of business, and then raise his prices. There's a guy named Lincoln Steffens. He investigated political corruption and political machines in the cities and the states, especially up in the Northeast. Another muckraker was a guy named Jacob Riis. Jacob Riis was a photojournalist, and he exposes the conditions that exist within the poor neighborhoods and immigrant neighborhoods. If you remember back to the Gilded Age, one of the accusations against the poor and the immigrants were that they were dirty and they didn't take care of themselves. And he went into their neighborhoods and he took pictures and said, these are the places they can live. These are the only places they can live. This is not their fault. Okay? And so if you think of the idea, social Darwinism, the poor are poor because it's their fault. Jacob Riis takes this picture of these kids. They are sleeping on top of a ventilation grate that would have been over the basement of one of the big cities, one of the big skyscrapers, so they can keep warm. Where should they be? They should be in school. They should be at home. They don't have a home. You got a couple of these kids without shoes. If this is their life, they're not going to go to school. If they're not going to go to school, they're not going to get an education. If they're not going to get an education, they're not going to get a decent job. If they're not going to get a decent job, they're going to stay poor. And if this is where they start out, how much of that is actually their fault? That's the question he poses to his readers when he shows these pictures. And then someone else that we've already talked about, Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells is a muckraker. And as she continued investigating, exposing those lynchings that occurred in the South against African Americans. So all these muckrakers are calling attention to the problems that existed. Another social movement, there was something called the Settlement House movement. So you see the progressives very involved in society. Okay? The Settlement House movement, what it was, there were centers, there were buildings that were established within the poor neighborhoods and neighborhoods of marginalized people, immigrants, and the whole point of the center or the building was to provide those people with basic services, basic help. Again, said this earlier, most of the staff are going to be middle-class women. Right? They have the ability to go in and volunteer at these places during the day. They're fulfilling the motherly role, taking care of people. This lady is named Jane Addams. Jane Addams set up and ran kind of the most well-known of the settlement houses, one in Chicago called Hull House. And if you see the size of this building, this is roughly the size of maybe half a city block. They provided a large number of services. They would have been located next to factories because they're in those poor neighborhoods. And so the things that the settlement houses provided to the people of the neighborhood, they just had a variety of things. Soup kitchens, those function when people are out of work, and hey, we're just going to provide you with a meal so that you don't starve to death. They also would provide like hot lunches during the wintertime for the guys working in the factories. A hot lunch can really get you going. If you're working in a factory and it's probably pretty cold back in the day before air conditioning and heating, you could go across the street to the settlement house instead of having to either eat your cold lunch or go home. Some of them also provided daycare. So they provided classes that taught people how to read or taught immigrants English. They also sometimes provided some very basic health care. Sometimes it's, well, we're going to set your leg. It ain't going to be that good. Maybe you need to go to a hospital. Other times it's going to be like, we can prescribe you some, low-level medications, whatever. They're not going to do brain surgery or anything. Don't think that. So a lot of social reforms with the progressives. In terms of economic reforms, there are a couple of things that they also wanted to do. With the economy, maybe there's less desire to really make big, huge changes here. But they did see the problems that existed within capitalism. And so they were interested in reforming capitalism and putting some brakes on some of the things that the capitalist system took to excess. That being said, socialists who would want to upend the system, they would also have been part of this progressive movement because they're saying, hey, here's capitalism. There are these bad things. And while everybody else is saying, yes, let's work and tweak and kind of clean up the bad things, the socialists would say, no, let's tear the whole thing down and build something that they would hope is better. With the economic reforms, what they wanted government to do was they wanted government to pass a lot of laws. Okay, just here are some of the problems. Monopolies are a problem. We need to limit monopolies. We need to protect workers with health and safety laws, protect consumers, regulate some of those business practices to make sure they're not exploiting people. And then a big thing was they wanted to end child labor. Okay, and while some people they want to end child labor because, well, if you can't hire children, you got to hire adults, and that's better for the adults. The progressives more look at it like we want to end child labor because we want kids to be able to go to school to get a better education to advance society. So they've got definitely more high-minded ideas in the idea of why we need to eliminate child labor, which these little girls refer to, if you see the banner that they're wearing, as child slavery. That'll get you right in the heartstrings. They also, and I put this under economic, they also wanted the government to increase taxes. They wanted an income tax, something that's going to be paid for by the wealthy, because mainly their thing is we want government to do so much stuff in economics and society and everything else. Government is going to need a lot of money in order to be able to do this. The only way to get the money is to raise taxes, and they ought to raise taxes on people that have high incomes and can afford it. All right, so we're almost at the end here. I just wanted to throw this in here. The progressive movement lasts from 1900 to 1920. Depending on where you see it, where you read, you might see it going all the way back from 1890 to 1920. And so the national impact of the progressives is they did add 4 amendments to the United States Constitution. They added the 16th Amendment. That's the creation of the income tax. Okay, so this is what they're going to say. We use the money in order to carry out the functions of government that we're going to want them to do. They added the 17th Amendment. That's the direct election of senators. That's where the people of each state elect the 2 senators they send to Washington. Prior to the progressives, it was usually a choice of the state legislatures, the 100 or 150 or so people in the state capital that decided who were the 2. Now it's going to be the choice of everyone. The 18th Amendment, prohibition, the ban on the production and sale of alcohol in the United States. Okay, this was a big deal. We'll deal more with that and the repercussions of that in the 1920s. And then finally, they added the 19th Amendment, women's suffrage, women's right to vote. Something that women had been calling for since, at the very least, the middle of the 1800s. So that's an introduction to the progressives. There is a lot more to come with the progressives and some of the progressive presidents and what they did. I hope you stick around, and I hope you go find that video so you can watch it as well. Other than that, y'all have a great rest of your day.